Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 40. You got the JWT, now what? And our guest today is Gabriel Leekman-Maynor, Director of Developer Relations at Permit.io, and Alex Babinu, CTO of Three Edges. Welcome, guys.
Welcome. Thanks.
And
Good to be here.
And maybe, Gabriel, we can start with a quick intro of, sort of your background and how you found yourself at Permit.io.
Yeah. So I started to work as a software developer 12 years ago, I guess. And at some point I got to Cisco. I started to work there on authorization server for network access, always as a software developer. I've never been like a IAM solution. I'm always confusing AIM with IAM. I never been like in the solution place or for customers as IAM architect or something like that. But I always, since I started to work on Cisco on this AAA authentication, authorization, and accounting server, I've been around somehow authentication or authorization. I've been a principal engineer and then staff engineer, and then I decided to cross the border into the more business/customers field. And I thought developer relation could be good because I love development and I've been developer myself. And then I met Or Weiss, the Permit.io CEO. Permit.io is in a mission to solve the authorization problem for software developers. There are many authorization products for IAM people, for security people, but we aim to provide the best developer experience. If a developer were to implement authorization, they don't need to do it like they did the same for any kind of application. And I felt like the best fit I can wish for. I know authorization, I know developers, and here I am today bridging the gap for authorization for developers.
Cool. And Alex, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and Three Edges.
Hi. Well, like Gabriel, I started in development with PeopleSoft. Back in the day, I was part of the architecture team at PeopleSoft HR, and we built a tool called the PeopleSoft Directory Interface, which was one of the first provisioning tools for LDAP directories. This was in the early 2000s. Then I stayed with Oracle because Oracle acquired PeopleSoft, and I was part of the OIM team then. I was a principal engineer for the Oracle Identity Manager. And then I left and went on my own and started consulting. So I've spent about 10 years in the field as a solutions architect for identity solutions, which gave me quite a lot of perspective on the actual issues that customers and people see in the field. And 3 years ago, we founded Three Edges because during that time as a consultant, I did a lot of solutioning using graph and graph databases. So now I'm kind of the graph guy wherever I walk. And so that's the foundation for Three Edges, because graphs enable not only developers but also business users to use and do authorization, and they can tackle complexity, and they're also the basis for AI. So that's where we're at in a short.
That's fascinating that I think a lot of people are so new to the industry, they forget about this previous generation of enterprise access management tools. Like SiteMinder and Oracle and Sun had a product, and and a lot of the business problems it was the same business problems. We have new technology, but a lot of the business problems that we were solving were the same back in those days. It's just like everything else has shifted from under us. Including JWT. So let's go back to Gabriel. Gabriel, you wrote a blog that said something to the effect of JWTs aren't for authorizations. It got a lot of attention and clicks. Why do you think that topic maybe hit a nerve with developers?
Yeah. So I wrote this article together with Daniel Bass, who is our technical writer at Permit.io. And the thing with JOT, the thing that we have this like controversial title, like JOT made for authorization, has a funny story behind that with a customer that started to use Permit. And then we find that they store a list of files that users own in the JWT. And they
Yeah.
say, okay, this is my authorization system. Here I store what a user have, but it has a lot of limitation, right? So JWTs, we all know that they are very trending, and for a good reason. They're self-validated. They can contain user entitlement and claims, and they can be dynamic. They can be very short valid. So you can have a new JWT for every, let's say, 60 seconds with new details about the user. And another point with JWTs is that they are very trending IAM thing for developers. If you think about it, like an IAM standards, like Scheme or maybe I don't know, even OAuth, they are very trending if you are going to Identity Conference, if you are IAM person. But for developers, they are just another standard that I don't know why I need to use that. JWT is a trend that is valid on developer. Ask a developer that what is the first thing that came to their mind about authentication, authorization. They would say JWT. They are so popular because they are very nature in the way that we are doing web development. And when a developer needs to develop fine-grained authorization or even just authorization, they're going to the first thing they know about IAM. They're going to JWTs, and they try to utilize them for authorization. And then we come and say, yes, you're right, JWTs can have a role in authorization, but they shouldn't be your authorization service. And that's the reason we decided, to be honest, our original plan was to have one blog like that, and then 2 weeks after a blog of how to use JWTs for authorization. But that one never came up. It actually came up as our part of one of our newsletters, but it never came up as a blog. But it's still on the backlog, so it will be out somewhere in the next month, I guess.
So do you think that developers should use JWTs as an authorization tool or not then? What's your opinion?
In short, I think developers should use JWTs for user claims and entitlement. They are a great source for user entitlements because you can self-validate them. You can have them very dynamic, so you can have it short-lived. I don't know if you are familiar with customer identity authentication provider. For example, Clerk, that is very popular in front-end authentication and like very like serverless types of authentication. The JWTs are valid for 60 seconds. So they say, okay, we are authentication provider. We don't care that JWT can be self-validated and can live for a long time. Our access token is valid for 60 seconds. So every 60 seconds, you can get the new entitlement. And then when you try to do enforcement of authorization, you can have a very updated one. So you don't need a PEEP, for example, for user attributes. You can use the JWTs for that. But you need to remember they are only one factor in the decision. They shouldn't do the decision and they shouldn't enforce the decision, which is two things that developers mistakenly do with JWTs.
Yeah. When I hear conversations like this, now I'm cracking up a little bit because it's really funny for me to hear in a way, so the developer perspective of JWTs versus my perspective. As somebody who leads a project that where we build an authorization server, the point of which is to issue JWTs. The first thing I would think is like, okay, what kind of JWT is this? Because a JWT is just a signed JSON structure, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think, is it an access token that was issued to a piece of software? Is it an ID token, an identity assertion that's been that documents an authentication event? Is it a software statement that's presented during client registration? Is it some type of other JWT, perhaps a verifiable credential, or maybe it's an updated OAuth status list? Like, so JWT to me is just like, it's JSON. Okay, it's a signed piece of JSON. That's nice, but who signed it? And what does it contain? And what's the schema? And how does it get managed? Like, what's the expiration? And so maybe, I guess, for my request, can I ask you to maybe distinguish what kind of JWT are we talking about here? Are we talking about an access token JWT or an ID token JWT? Just starting from that fork.
I think you just made a great statement, because that part of the things that developers are using JWT, they are mainly access tokens. Access tokens that contains identity. That's the way, that's the edge of the JWT that most
Wait, can we just
application
stop
developers.
there?
Yeah.
So an access token, now, okay, I have an OAuth framework, so work with me here. But there's an OAuth token endpoint, and the access token is issued as a result of a successful client authentication. So a piece of software like a mobile app or a website or a browser-based application calls the token endpoint, says, here's my client ID and some secret. Please give me an access token. So there's no user in that flow. It's a piece of software interacting with the token endpoint. So we have a client entity, i.e. the client ID, but we don't really have a person there. So how do you go from access token to person identity? I'm wondering.
So the perspective that you describe is your perspective, authentication provider, right?
Yeah.
So you cared about the handshake, you care, for example, about the signature. But for me as a developer, I only care about maybe two things. I care about that I can trust someone else who verify my user identity, and I can trust someone else that give me the most up-to-date user claims. That's the thing I need, right? And probably I'll get it via the access token. It can be via the ID token at some points. But in general, I don't need to understand or to know everything about JWTs or about your authentication provider. I need to know about the thing that helping my application to function with my users, right? So if you look on that from the OAuth perspective and the benefits that OAuth brings to the table, like federated identities and externalizing authentication or authorization, or having, let's say, what's the name, like OAuth scopes for kind of authorization that OAuth tried to provide. Yeah, you're right. JWTs has many aspects. And I'm thinking about it from what claims I have in this one, how I'm signing each JWT. I need a JWT as a JSON because that helped me to be distributed. But that's not what a standard application developer care about, right? They have a lot of headache because their application is complex, because they have every day a new front-end framework to deal with. They have every day a new cloud-native observability server that they need for their audit. They don't care about how this authentication works. And the JWT is, or even more specific, like access token or ID token, they are naturally involved in this software development. They don't care about. So just as an example, we had a live stream with John Bradley, one of the JWT inventors, a couple of
Yeah,
weeks
also
ago.
an Identirati office hours guest who, when he spoke with us about FIDO, but he's
Yeah,
knowledgeable on many fronts. So yeah,
yeah,
what was your
and
conversation about?
so one part of the conversation was about signatures and about
Mhm.
many authentication providers that actually do not care or do not provide you any information about what signature they use for JWTs. And in the days of quantum computing or even like Gen AI brute force types,
Uh-huh.
some signatures are irrelevant today. But I don't know many developers who care about it. JWT is self-validated. It has signatures. It has claim. It works in JSON. I don't need any more of that. I don't care of signature. I don't care of the types of tokens that you actually use to do handshakes and to make me to create me access tokens, right? So I
Yeah.
think most of the developers out there are care about the way it's JSON, so it's comfortable and it's like any other structure of data that I have in my app.
Sure.
It has my user claims, and someone else provide us to me, someone else that I trusted. That's all, right? And at this point, people are doing very weird things with JWTs.
Alex, maybe you could throw some extra perspective on this. I mean, this
Yeah.
is definitely the developer perspective. Do you agree that that developers maybe don't care so much about how these things get signed or how they got obtained, and they just want to get their jobs done, And and do you see other use cases, especially in the enterprise space, about more careful use of JWTs, let's say?
Well, not only do I agree with Gabriel, but I've seen it live. Developers will do the easiest thing possible to get the job done, and I've seen it with clients in the field, which sometimes results in horrible things. Which is why I generally don't like the use of JWTs. I generally prefer opaque tokens myself. Anyway, so one thing I wanted to comment on for what you said, Mike, the access of the token endpoint is really the second half of the flow. We're forgetting the first half, which is really the gathering the user consent to get the token. If you're using a proper OAuth flow, typically it would be the authorization code flow, which allows for user interaction, right? So your user gets to a client app. That client app tries to access a user's resource. Now the client needs to, that resource need to be granted access to the client app. So you need to collect that grant. And that first part is actually quite key in the OAuth flow. That's the authorization piece, really.
Correct. So if we're talking about an OpenID Connect flow, so there was a code flow, and the code was presented at the token endpoint, and with the client credentials, right? And actually, generally the access token returned will contain the scopes that can be presented at the user info endpoint for information. But in the access token, there normally is no user information there per se. You'd have to, on Jan's auth server, for example, you would have to add into the interception script. And if you want to put user claims there, you could do it, but it's not standard. I would say it's more standard to put user claims in either the ID token or just to return them from user info. So it's true that the access token might have scopes, but the access token might have other critical information too. For example, the organization ID. A lot of times we're implementing multi-tenancy by saying this piece of software was written by this company, and therefore we want to make sure that the access token is tagged with a certain organization ID, because maybe we want to make policies not just on the scopes, but also on maybe the organization who's calling that. So I see the access token as being ripe for putting information in that you might want to make policy on. But I really think that in a way, maybe the OpenID Connect community has done a bad job communicating what an ID token is and how it's useful. It's not really a token at all. It's more like an identity assertion, like a SAML assertion. It gives the details of an authentication event. And that's critical for authorization, because today I might want to say not just that, this is user Mike, but it's user Mike using a hardware-bound passkey, right?
Right.
And not a shared synced passkey. So the details of the authentication event, when I authenticated, how I authenticated, what type of authenticator I used, that's really interesting, useful input for policy. But those types of things are detailed in the authentication event, which is represented by an ID token. Now,
so that's actually a good point, because what I've seen a lot is you're cramming so much data in your access token or JWT that you're exploding the header limits, for example. I've seen it live, right? People put all kinds of stuff in their access token. Oh, it's easy. Let's just add that. Let's just add that. And eventually it's so bloated that it actually fails to be communicated on the line, right? And also whatever you cram in there eventually expires. Now, I know, Gabriel, you mentioned it's good when you expire those tokens very fast, but then you have to refresh the data. But not all organizations do it. Some tokens are live for a couple of hours. And then you have to have another system to invalidate the claims. Well, we can talk about shared signals, which is something that could be used for that. But you see, it gets more complicated. And then if you use that for authorization, you might grant access where you shouldn't if some claims are not valid anymore. So there's a lot of considerations, right?
That's correct. I mean, I just took the time to speak, and I went to some customer authentication providers like Clerk and Auth0 and
Mhm.
Kind, and some of the trending names there. They are all giving you, as a first-class citizen, the option to put claims and scopes in the access token. That's a
Yeah.
Sure.
practice.
Yeah.
And again, the reason for that is the experience they want to give the developers. They want to minimize the friction of the developer with the authentication provider to the minimum possible in the application code. So they tell you, okay, you don't need anything in our SDK. The only thing you need is get the access token. We'll do everything else for you. We'll do the authentication flow, we'll do the sign up, we'll do the audit, we'll do the user creation, we'll do everything. The only thing that you'll have to do is have a middleware where you get the JWT. And a result of that is, okay, get this access token in the time frame that we are recreate that for you. It could be short, it could be long, it all has pros and cons. But I say our only point where we meet each other in the code is where you get the access token, and that's where the
Mhm.
problems start, because most of these 80% of the application developers out there, especially in startups and SMBs, they did not have this IAM team that create best practices, that knows flow, that say, okay, you have a distributed architecture, you have a microservice architecture. There is a standard for that. There is standard for OAuth server. Let's use something open source. Let's deploy something. They don't have that. They have the authentication provider that is the source of truth of how authentication should work. And the authentication provider play with JWT because, again, it's easy and it's accessible and it's JSON. Everyone knows how to handle that. And that get back to the main point of, okay, let's do authorization. Let's base our authorization on JWTs. And that's very easy. And let's look, for example, on OAuth scopes, right? So originally, OAuth scopes aim for explicit representation of user permissions, like user read or user write.
Mhm.
But in a world of fine-grained authorization, where we want to have policy-based access control, attribute-based access control, or graph-based access control, we want to have fine-grained ownership of files. Scopes are not relevant. Scopes are relevant, but with a grain of salt, with the policy engine or the GraphDB that can help us understand the permissions that is result of this scope, right?
Yeah.
There is
So
such a
if
thing.
you're
You're right. As role explosion, right? Because you have fine grained requirements, you need so many scopes to express those requirements that in the end you end up with a bloated token and you don't know anymore, how many scopes you are, who has what, who
Mhm.
manages the scopes. There's actually no
Yeah,
standards for scopes. It's a string, could be anything. So if you're
yeah,
doing partnerships with others, federation, then you got to consume other people's scopes now. uh,
th- that's correct, and that made people think, okay, I have the access token. The access token has scopes. They never go to read the RFC. They understand scope because they are very explicit. It's a user read. Okay, that's permissions, and they say, but user read is not enough. I need also understanding ownership, understanding relationship. So I'll add more scopes, right? And the scopes became more and more. And then at some point, you want to have a policy condition on top of that, and then you just complex it more and more. So you have, okay, I have scopes, but I also have a claim, and the claim will help me calculate the policy decision. So again, what we try to come and say, JWTs are great, but they shouldn't be the base authorization service that you have.
Can I just say, it sounds like, I understand your point about scopes, but it seems like a non sequitur to me, honestly, because this is a multi-sided market, where we have authorization requirements that are specific for the application, and we have authorization requirements that are specific for API access management, and we have authorization requirements that are specific for the backend. And we might have solutions, data that we need to put into the access token that's different for all three of those things. So for example, if I'm writing a mobile application, it would be handy for me to know if you require a device bound key, because I'm in a good position in the mobile app to ask to call the FIDO Android SDK and ask you to present your FIDO. So a policy about the authorization requirements, on the front end, let's say, go there. Now, scopes work great for API access management. If I just want to filter, to do a post or a get on this API, you need this scope. Scopes work well for that. And I think one of to speak in favor of scopes, Google has shown that with their scopes, management of scopes for a lot of public APIs, that approach works for them for the purpose of controlling clients' access to certain APIs on the user's behalf. But on the backend side, we might have delegated administration requirements for us. So for an enterprise, for example, only this organization can see their own data. And we might need to know that on the back end. So in a way, to attack scopes and say, well, they're not that good because I can't do my front end or my back end authorization, I think it's just like we're trying to push maybe one concern onto JWTs that doesn't really fit for them. I guess my follow-up question then would be, what is the right place in the architecture? And I'll throw this one at you, Gabriel, since you wrote the blog. Where is the right place to use JWTs? Do you want to use it in the front end, in the API layer, in the back end? And if you do, how do you account for those various use cases for security and policy?
Yeah, I think before I answer where you want to use JWT, I'll try to have a little zoom out to the utopic world of authorization services. In the optimal authorization service should work this way. We should have centralized policy configuration. Think about database. So you have a centralized schema of your configuration. This is where you have policy rules, maybe. This is where you have schema of your relationships in the GraphDB. This server should be centralized and should manage all the policies, like mobile policies, server policies, whatever it is, it should be centralized. Why it should be centralized? Because first, you want to audit it in a centralized place. Second, you want to minimize the effort of configuring stuff. So you don't want, for example, that your front end will use one library for configuring policy rules and your backend will use another library, and where you need relationship because you have a distributed system, you're using another schema. So you preferably want to have a centralized configuration somewhere. Could be even if we're taking in a one level of abstraction on top of the running server, you should have one Git repository where all your configuration sits.
And in fact, in the policy decision point, enforcement point, there's one role that says PRP, policy repository. So I think we all agree, the policies need to be externalized.
We can work it out with the PXP.
What policy syntax they should be in, that's a different question.
Yes.
Absolutely. But again, the optimal should have centralized PRP, or there is another should have centralized PRP. Yeah. PIP is the point that should maybe connect.
Well, let's talk about the PIP actually. So a lot of times, and maybe Alex, this is a chance for you to talk a little bit more about the graph database. But in the database land, you put the database in the right way. You can ask the right questions. Different databases are optimized for different query problems. But in the standard authorization infrastructure, there's normally a PIP. So it's okay, we have our policies, but those are abstract. What about our once we need entities in order to say, these are this actual person should have access based on this actual organization he's a member of. So in your view, what I posited in the announcement for this episode is that the JWT has become a new PIP. But Alex, let me throw this one at you. For your sort of strategy of authorization at three edges, where do you see the PIP? And do you think that, do you see a case for the JWT maybe being a self-contained package that should contain all the information you need to evaluate a certain policy?
Well, okay, so a couple of things to unpack. There's several two main schools of thought for authorization. First of all, where I really want to emphasize what Gabriel said, please externalize your authorization rules and centralize it somewhere, because in the end, you always need to know who has access to what. And if you're a developer and if you're hard coding code in your app and using JWTs, nobody will ever know who has access to what.
And from a SOC 2 ISO, compliance standpoint, there's regulations that say you need to have your policies defined, and if you externalize them in some type of declarative syntax, then they're auditable. And if they're not auditable, we know what happens there. So yeah, everyone agrees here.
That's
externalize,
right. Yeah. All our tools, they have audit trails. You can look at stuff. You can ask questions. So then there's schools of thought about how to go about, and I'm getting to the graph part. So one school of thought is your rules should be code. So we call them policy as code. So you have a back system that use languages or whatever to express rules. Another school of thought, the graph thought, is policy as data. In other words, you build your graph database in such a way that the policy is the data itself. And what we do in the graph database, we look for relationships between subjects and resources. And if we can find those relationships in the data, then we grant access. So it's a very flexible model, and a model that allows you to tackle very complex use cases, because graph databases, as you said, Mike, some databases are better than others for certain things. Well, graph databases are exceptionally good at modeling relationships. And a lot of data and a lot of problems are relationship problems in an enterprise in particular. In fact, everything is related to everything else, like even role membership. It's actually a relationship between users and an entity called a role. You can model it in a graph. When organizations come together and partner with each other, that is a relationship. And now so you see how that goes. So that's essentially the thing. So whenever you're asking an authorization question to a graph-based system, you have to parse the data. Now, where the JWT comes into place, JWTs can provide context.
Before we go there, can I ask you one follow-up question? Is it so 3Edges has a PDP, a policy decision point?
Yeah.
Does that PDP always need a connection to a database?
Yes.
Or can that database be self-contained in memory?
So there's two again, like there's two schools. There's generally RBAC, or relationship-based access control systems, are stateful, which means they have an embedded database. But that comes with the drawback of having to keep that data up to date, because especially in an authorization system, your data needs to be fresh. If you're acting on stale data, you might grant access where you shouldn't. So that's a problem. So the more dynamic the data, the more problematic this becomes, which is why we are actually stateless. We make it so that we can run fast queries on the graph database. And the key is to have the database as close as possible to the PDP. So there's techniques, but depending on which, we're in the under 50 millisecond responses, so it's slower than 1 millisecond if we were embedded in embedded database. But the advantage is that we don't have to keep that. There's not such a burden on keeping the data fresh. The database is always there, and we can scale up our services to any kind of load very easily.
So that would lead me to believe that your authorization service is better suited to being deployed in the cloud as a cloud authorization solution.
Absolutely. It's a cloud-based system for sure. Now we can deploy it. We are deploying this at customer sites, like on-prem as well, but Kubernetes, so wherever you can run Kubernetes.
But not running autonomous. So Gabriel, let me bring this back to you. And so there's an idea, like Alex had a very good point about how the data has to be fresh. Well, what's fresher than an access token? We just said that it's probably like a minute old. Maybe that's not fresh enough.
In the best cases, as we said, right?
Too. But what if we say, okay, all the data that we need is contained in that JWT, and wouldn't that also help us with in a microservices architecture? Your microservice is supposed to not have any external dependencies like a database. So if we just rely on the JWT, couldn't we actually say that the JWT is the source of all the information that we need for our policy?
Yeah. I think one of the reasons that I personally don't like to use the PXP terminology when it comes to developers who try to use that is because, like, particularly the PXP is very specific for the IAM domain.
Wait, what's a PSP?
PXP, I call it like PP, PIP,
P
like
P.
the standard of PXP, whatever it is,
So
right?
you're just saying you don't like the PIP, PDP,
I
PEP,
personally like
PRP,
that because that
PAP.
helped me. No,
Yeah,
I like that because for me it helped me with my IAM community friends, and it
right.
helped me to put things on a whiteboard when I'm speak with permit friends. But when
Yeah.
I'm trying to speak with people from the like developers who try to do
They didn't read
authorization,
the Martin
I say,
Fowler design patterns book from like 1990 something. Isn't that what it's in? Actually? Yeah.
yeah, so I really trying to say, okay, you need authorization. You can externalize it in multiple ways, and not everything is fit for every type of system. As you said, like for example, when you are talking about a pure microservice architecture, I really like to take the domain-driven design approach for authorization service, because then you can say that you have your authorization domain and you have your users domain, and then you can make sure that your authorization is independently managed as a domain, as an external domain, and other domain can consume services in the best practices of domain driven design. But I mean, let's get to the point of the PIP and the PRP. Let's stick with PRP, where your schema and configuration sits, and the PIP, where your data set, right? And back to the Alex point, relationship and graph database, it's indeed stateful. But we have very good tools to manage stateful systems, right? With correctness and state machines and stuff like that. I mean, I don't know yet, and sorry about that, the three edges in details, but for example, in OpenFGA and SpiceDB, two very famous like relationship-based access control graph DBs, there is states that you can manage. You can roll back to states. You can see at any point of time which state you are. So you have the data that you need for the relationship in the graph DB. The JWT, on the other end, can provide you more policy-oriented data that you might need about the user. So, for example, you have this system of this data system of graph DBs. And imagine it as the most abstract graph that you have. You have in the graph users, and you have in the graph resources as nodes, and the edges determine the permissions that user have, right? And the edges maybe can have a level of granularity that say, this is the level of permissions you want to have. And then you can use the claims for more general conditions on top of that, right? You can use a claim of, as you mentioned multiple times, the claim of physical authentication to have another level of granularity of conditions on top of that. So if you have an external authorization system that separates the schema is deciding the rules, like the abstract rule, like a user with a physical authentication, a user with that did a physical authentication can have permissions that derive for a particular role on a specific path of relationship, right? That's the optimal way we want our PRP to have. Then we want to have our PIP that can be, I mean, you can imagine it in multiple angles, but let's say the PIP could be the stateful PIP, like the graph DB itself, the data itself of the relationship, and the stateless PIP, which is the data that's stored in the JWT itself. And then you have the PDPs. And the PDP is not like the PIP that could be centralized for graph or stateful for graph and stateless and decentralized for JWT. The PDP must be decentralized because that's the only way you can ensure that the centralized schema is enforced the same by all the PDPs. If you have PDPs that are centralized, but on the other end, if you have PDPs that are centralized, then you lose all the developers, because no one wants a centralized piece to be connected to their app. As you mentioned, in microservice architecture, you never want to have a centralized microservice that everyone depend on. But if the PDP is decentralized and can run, for example, as a sidecar for every microservice, then you separate the duties, right? You decouple the responsibilities. So you have the responsibility of the schema. That's the part of the traditional PRP. You have the responsibility of the data that could be stateful for graph and data that is relevant only for authorization, could be stateless based on JWTs for the user or for some other DB schema for resource attributes. And then you have the PDPs that are decentralized and stateless, always. And then you have the benefits of have externalized authorization service that can manage itself, make sure that they have both correctness on the graph stateful and verification on the stateless information. And then you have the decentralized PDP that can live in every modern microservice authorization.
I'm going to agree with you and say that I think there's a business case for having a PDP that's decentralized. But I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. It doesn't mean that you can also have a centralized PDP. So I think that's what the industry has yet to work out. But I want to pivot the conversation a little bit. We just have one more question left, really running late. And my last question is your article also talked about some of the hygiene around JWTs. For example, validating the signatures. Yeah, I would think you'd need to know the right signature algorithm. And also validating the expiration of the token, for example, or the status of the token. And is the PDP, and so a lot of the examples you gave me, there's one issuer of tokens. It's Auth0 or it's some other provider. But what if there are multiple issuers of access tokens that are consumed in the application? Shouldn't which issuers of ID token or which issuers of access tokens you trust, isn't that an authorization policy? And do you think that the authorization infrastructure should maybe take over this role? Because you're saying developers hate this anyway, and it's an annoyance to them. Do you think that the PDP should actually take over this role of doing some of this JWT hygiene?
Yeah, so if we are looking again on the optimal architecture, the PDP should be agnostic to where the JWT came from. That's something you should configure in the schema. Of course,
What
the
if there's
PDP will get the decision based on the schema, right?
Right, but what if there's multiple issuers? Let's say you're saying just
Correct, but
model that in your schema.
yeah, multiple issuer at the end are sort of attribute. If you look on a policy-based system and not on a spaghetti-based system where you mix between where the policy configure and when the policy enforced and when the policy get decision, the issuer of a JWT is another attribute, right? It's an attribute that we can have a schema of policy that configure decisions based off.
So it sounds like
And
trust
same
management
for
should
this.
maybe move to the PDP then, because you're saying, well, it's an attribute and we should make policy on it. But that implies also that we're going to download its public keys and that there'll be a different signature verification.
So I think that there are 2 points we can take from this question. One point is what I mentioned, the point that where you actually have policy rules based on JWT issuer or on JWT attributes, like a higher signature can get you more permissions. That a policy decision that should be part of the schema. The PIP, also known as the stateless JWT, should provide the data, and the PDP should get the decision. Right? That's the way we can work, and that's the way we can incorporate authorization with JWT attributes like issuer and stuff like that. The other question is, do our decision point should have the functionality to verify tokens. And that's also something that we are often considering permit, because if you have, as you mentioned, if you have like a JWT issuer that is a server provider or like external OAuth, and you have a JWT issuer that is customer identity like Auth0 and stuff like that, maybe the PDP should have some functionality to verify them and incorporate that into the decision.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe you should take the authentication or the verification that we call today authentication a step backward and give the authorization engine the power to do these verifications.
Right. Or
That's a
moving the
great
trust
question.
management. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're a little over time. I'm going to give our co-host Alex last thoughts. Alex, before we break.
Yeah, I think JWTs are great, but they should be used with a grain of salt. In particular, I think what you put in the JWT could be used for coarse-grained authorization. Like you said, access to an API, can you do post on that? That's very coarse-grained, probably okay to have scopes. Also, a good idea maybe to use them for context, as you said, the authentication level, maybe some other context kind of attributes that could be used for authorization. And I think that PDP should absolutely be able to validate access tokens, especially if they use an external identity provider.
And check out 3edges.com.
Please do.
Yeah. Gabriel, last thoughts?
I should do. Yeah, so I think I totally agree with Alex's thoughts regarding use JWTs for context. They are a great source for context when it needs to be the decision. And I really want to say developers, there are many cool IAM standards that are not that hard to incorporate like JWTs. So just take a little learn on IAM standards and understand how they can help you incorporate with a modern fine-grained authorization system and do it the right way.
Check out permit.io, read the blog also. Okay, well, I just want to announce our next episode. Next week, we have Canada and Congo, two countries you don't normally see together in one podcast. We're going to talk about challenges around national ID. No country has really figured this one out yet. There's been some real front runners, who are sort of bleeding edge, but I still think this is a societal, cultural thing that we need to address. And we're going to hear the two most probably contrasting, a very mature democracy and a very emerging nation with 600 different, I think, languages spoken or 300 different languages in Congo. So a very diverse country. So I'm excited about that. If you could, audience, please follow Identity Office Hours on LinkedIn. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers. And with that, I'll thank our guests. Thank you guys so much for staying a couple minutes over, and great conversation. So thanks a lot, audience, and thank you, guests.
Thanks
a bunch, Mike, for hosting us.
Fun to be here.
Okay.